It's a funny thing about life's rough patches. When the ground gets rocky, most folks look around for who to blame. The boss, the wife, the government, bad luck. Like trouble, some outside force just waiting to ambush you. There was a man who believed that wholeheartedly for most of his days until the very ground beneath him gave way. That man was Garrett. 47 years old, worked a noisy line in a metal shop, punching out parts that looked identical to the million before them. You'd see it in his hands first, thick and scarred, forever ingrained with the grime of the factory floor, capable of immense, stubborn force. Then his face, a landscape of hard living, etched deep with weariness around eyes that had seen too much and expected little. He was a gruff man, often quiet, but carried a chip on his shoulder so big you could almost hear it scraping against doorframes. Beneath the frustration, though, you could still sense a deep, unyielding strength, like an old oak battered by too many storms. His days ran on a track worn smooth by repetition, a grind that started before dawn and ended long after dusk. The alarm on his phone, a shrill, tinny complaint, went off at 5 a.m. sharp. Garrett would slam a palm down on it, not quite turning it off, just silencing it for a few more grudging minutes. The air in his small, older house always felt thin and cold in the pre-dawn dark. He'd heave himself out of bed, the mattress groaning in protest as much as his own stiff joints. Coffee, black and bitter, was a ritual along with a piece of toast, sometimes burnt, swallowed quickly while scrolling through bad news headlines on his phone. More fodder for the bitterness brewing inside. The system was rigged, he'd mutter to himself, seeing the world through a lens of perpetual grievance. He'd be out the door before the first hint of color touched the sky, the old Chevy truck sputtering to life, its engine a familiar rumble of impending maintenance. The drive to the plant was a blur of identical streetlights, forgotten storefronts, and the slow, steady march of other lonely headlights on the asphalt. Inside the factory, the air hung heavy with the metallic tang of cut steel and the acrid bite of lubricants. Machines shrieked and clanged, a relentless symphony that vibrated through the concrete floor and deep into Garrett's bones. He stood at his station, feeding raw material into the hungry press, watching as it stamped out part after identical part. A million of them. His body moved with a practiced, almost robotic efficiency while his mind drifted, often settling on the bills stacked on the kitchen counter, each envelope a small, relentless reminder of what he lacked. Rent was always due. The truck needed new tires. The fridge made a suspicious hum that sounded expensive. Every paycheck felt like a sieve, barely catching enough to cover the gaps before the next cascade of expenses. He saw other guys, younger mostly, talking about vacations, new cars, little league games. Garrett would just grunt, pushing another piece of metal into the press. Easy for them, he'd think. They don't know what real struggle is. Haven't seen the world chew up good men and spit them out. He believed his lack of advancement, his constant financial strain, wasn't a reflection of his choices, but rather the unfairness of it all. The economy, the managers who overlooked him, the politicians who didn't care about the working man, they were all complicit in keeping him down. Lunch breaks were usually solitary affairs. A cold sandwich eaten quickly in the break room, or sometimes in the truck if the weather was decent enough. He'd listen to the radio, another source of frustration, the pundits and politicians always talking about things that felt miles away from his reality, always missing the point. They don't get it, he'd fume silently. They never will. The factory clock seemed to mock him, the second hand crawling until quitting time. When the whistle finally blew, the roar of the machines finally died down to a dull hum. It was a release, but not a relief. Just the end of one struggle and the beginning of another. The quiet, empty hours at home. His house, though small, felt cavernous at times. It was functional, yes, but wore the years like a tired garment, much like Garrett himself. The couch sagged in the middle, the paint on the walls was faded, and there was always a light film of dust that seemed to settle no matter how much he cleaned. A scattering of old magazines, a half-empty mug of coffee on the end table, a toolbox perpetually open in the corner of the garage. It all spoke of a life lived, but not necessarily nurtured. A life put on hold. He would sometimes catch his reflection in the darkened window at night, after a few beers, the television droning forgotten in the background. What he saw was a man worn, yes, but also a man burdened. A man who carried a weight that wasn't just physical fatigue. It was the weight of what could have been the silent echo of buried dreams. He'd once imagined more for himself. Maybe owning his own small repair shop, hands-on, the master of his own trade. Maybe a comfortable family life, the kind he saw on commercials, not the strained, distant relationship he had with his grown kids who rarely called. And when they did, it was usually a terse request for money or a curt goodbye. He'd always blamed his ex-wife for poisoning their minds against him, for making them choose. He'd blamed the market for his failed investment, the bank for the repossessed car years ago, the government for not doing enough, his bosses for their incompetence and favoritism. Every setback, every disappointment, every unanswered phone call from his children was a nail in the coffin of his past hopes, each one hammered in by someone else's fault, someone else's mistake. He yearned for respect, for a quiet connection, but his gruff exterior, that ever-present chip, served as a wall, pushing away the very things he secretly craved. He was afraid, deep down, that if he ever truly stopped blaming others, he'd have to confront the uncomfortable truth, that the man staring back at him in the darkened glass wasn't who he wanted to be, and perhaps, just perhaps, he had played a part in building the life he now endured. The thought was a dark, persistent hum, like the factory machines, always there just beneath the surface noise of his daily grievances. The alarm clock on his nightstand shrieked at 5 a.m., a metallic bird with a broken song, dragging Garrett from a restless half-sleep that offered little true rest. His small house, functional but worn, smelled faintly of stale coffee and the ghost of last night's microwave dinner. The linoleum floor in the kitchen was scuffed. The cupboards held a meager collection of single-serve meals and instant coffee, and the chipped Formica counter was often buried under bills, electric, water, a reminder from the truck's finance company, a collection notice for an old medical bill he swore he'd paid. He'd pull on his worn work boots, heavy with the weight of countless shifts, grab the thermos filled with black coffee, and head out to his old pickup. Its engine groaned in protest most mornings, a symphony of worn parts that matched his own aging joints, but he coaxed it to life, pushing it hard just like he pushed himself. The drive to the plant was a blur of pre-dawn streets, the same sequence of traffic lights, the same faded billboards. Inside, the factory floor was a world of relentless noise and grime, a symphony of bangs, clangs, and the high-pitched whine of machinery that burrowed into your bones. Garrett stood at his station, feeding raw steel sheets into the press, the rhythm mind-numbingly familiar. Push the steel, slam the lever, pull out the shaped piece. Repeat, thousands of times a day. His hands, thick and scarred, moved with an automatic precision born of years, but his mind, even as it went through the motions, was rarely quiet. He'd watch the younger guys, fresh out of trade school, full of energy he no longer possessed, joking, talking about weekend plans, new video games. Garrett mostly kept to himself, exchanging grunts more often than words, a silent critic of their perceived naivete, their endless optimism that he knew, deep down, the world would eventually grind out of them. He knew because it had ground it out of him. The hours crawled, each one punctuated by the insistent hum of the machines and the growing ache in his lower back. When the final whistle blew, he was just another shadow among many heading back to his truck, the day's meager earnings already mentally allocated to the pile of bills on his counter. Every paycheck felt like a cruel joke, a temporary reprieve before the next wave of demands washed over him. But even amidst the din of the factory, a different kind of noise rattled in Garrett's head, a persistent echo of a life unlived. He'd once seen himself as a craftsman, not a cog. A man who built things, fixed things, maybe had his own name above a door. A small, clean garage, tools neatly arrayed, the faint scent of oil and wood in the air, the quiet satisfaction of a job done right for a customer who trusted him. That vision, vivid in his younger days, was now a dusty, faded photograph in the attic of his mind, pulled out only on lonely nights, or when the weight of his current existence became too heavy to bear. It was a ghost of a possible future that had never materialized, a constant reminder of the gap between the man he was and the man he'd wanted to be. The quiet fear, sharp and cold, was that he was simply not enough, not smart enough, not lucky enough, not strong enough. That all the promises he'd made to himself, to his younger self, had been broken by him, not just by circumstance. That gnawing uncertainty was what fed his anger, what kept that chip firmly planted on his shoulder. His gruffness, that quick snap of frustration when a coworker asked too many questions or a machine jammed, wasn't just a habit. It was armor. Every sneer, every complaint about the system, about the man, about the incompetent bosses, was a way to avoid looking too closely at the man underneath, the one who sometimes felt a deep ache of regret. He yearned for respect, for a quiet connection with his children, for a sense that his life meant something more than just pushing steel through a machine. His chosen way of being, a perpetually wronged man, had built walls instead of bridges, pushing away the very things he secretly craved. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that facing himself, truly facing his own part in his misfortunes, would be far more painful than any physical labor. The factory floor was solid ground. His own introspection was a quicksand pit he refused to step into. His own introspection was a quicksand pit he refused to step into. Then came the fall, not a sudden drop, but a series of cracks that spiderwebbed across the thin ice of his life until it splintered completely. It started subtle, a thicker envelope in the mail slot one Tuesday morning. Not junk mail, not a bill he recognized. Just official-looking with a return address that made his stomach clench. He tore it open with a familiar surge of defensive anger, already primed to blame the postal service, the banks, the goddamn government. But the words on the page were stark, impossible to misinterpret. Eviction notice, 30 days, his chest tightened, a cold fist squeezing around his heart. They couldn't do this. He always paid, just a little late sometimes. It wasn't fair. The familiar litany of grievances began to hum in his head, a soundtrack to the end of his world. A week later, the truck was gone. He'd gone out to leave for work, the 5 a.m. chill already biting, keys in hand, and where his battered F-150 should have been, there was only an empty patch of oil-stained asphalt. Not stolen, he realized with a sickening lurch as he spotted the small, neatly folded note tucked under his doormat. Repossessed. He stood there, the early morning silence amplifying the ringing in his ears. His only reliable way to get to the factory gone. His last shred of independence hauled away in the dead of night like a common criminal's loot. The humiliation burned, a raw, blistering heat across his face. Damn bankers, damn economy, damn everyone. The bitterness flowed, a familiar poison. But the final blow, the one that truly shattered the protective shell of his anger, came that evening. His phone, which rarely rang for anything other than telemarketers or work emergencies, buzzed with an unfamiliar number. A flicker of hope, foolish and fragile, sparked within him. Maybe one of his kids. He answered gruffly. It was his daughter, Sarah. Her voice, usually warm even when distant, was flat, devoid of emotion. He tried to explain, to complain, to tell her about the eviction, the truck, the unfairness of it all. He heard the sigh on the other end, the way she cut him off. "Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "just stop. We're tired. There's nothing left to say." He started to protest, to argue, to demand, but then he heard the click. Not just on his end, but an audible click of the line disconnecting. He called back. No answer. Called his son, straight to voicemail. The silence that followed was absolute, crushing. His hands, calloused and strong, trembled as he lowered the phone. No truck, no home, no kids, nothing. He wandered into the garage, the one place that still felt like his, even though it too would soon be taken. It was cluttered, dimly lit by a single bare bulb hanging precariously from a wire. The air hung thick with the ghosts of oil and sawdust, of projects half-finished and tools long unused. He ran his hand over a workbench littered with rusted bolts and forgotten wrenches. His gaze fell on a broken torque wrench. Its handle snapped clean off, the polished, twisted metal glinting faintly. He picked it up, turned it over in his fingers. The sharp edge of the brake caught the light, and in its dull reflection he saw his face. It wasn't just tired. It wasn't just sad. It was a face contorted by years of festering resentment, etched with lines of perpetual grievance. The eyes were narrowed, suspicious, perpetually scanning for the next enemy. He saw the chip, heavy and sharp, plain as day on his own shoulder. And in that moment, staring at his own distorted image in the broken tool, a cold, hard truth, devoid of any anger or blame, finally seeped into his bones. Eviction, repossession, estranged children, failed investments, lost jobs, every single damn setback. The only common denominator, the one constant in every single misfortune, was staring back at him from the gleaming shard of broken metal. Him, the house felt like a tomb that night, or what was left of it. Most of his meager belongings were already boxed, stacked in the living room like monuments to a life dismantled. The quiet was oppressive, punctuated only by the low hum of the ancient refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of a cheap plastic clock on the kitchen wall. Garrett lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the glow of the digital clock on his nightstand burning a furious red. 3:17 a.m. Sleep was a foreign concept, a luxury he couldn't afford. Every muscle in his body ached, not from work, but from the unbearable weight of emptiness. The familiar anger his old friend tried to surface. The bank, the landlord, his ex-wife, the kids for not understanding, the company for laying him off years ago. He felt the words forming on his tongue, the arguments rehearsed 1,000 times. But tonight they tasted like ash. They held no power. There was nowhere left to point the finger. The mirror in the garage had done its work. He closed his eyes, and images flashed behind his eyelids. The proud smile of his younger self on his wedding day, the eager faces of his kids on Christmas morning, the hopeful glint in his eye when he started his own small repair business that eventually went bust. He saw the choices he made, the opportunities he'd let slip through his fingers because someone else was always to blame. He saw the conversations where he'd chosen to complain instead of listen, to accuse instead of understand. He heard the endless litany of his own grievances, replaying like a broken record, pushing people away, burning bridges. His life, he realized with a sickening clarity, was a monument to blaming everyone else. And now, at 47 years old, with an eviction notice on the table, his truck gone, and his children unwilling to speak to him, he had nothing left to show for it. Just an empty house, an empty wallet, and an even emptier heart. The fear of not being enough, which he'd buried so deep, now screamed in his ear. But it wasn't the fear of being not enough. It was the horrifying realization that he had chosen to be less. He had chosen bitterness over effort, complaint over change, resentment over responsibility. The raw honesty of it was a knife twisting in his gut. There was no escape. He was at the bottom of a well, and he had dug it himself. The air was thin, the walls slick, and there was absolutely no one to call for help. Just him alone with the brutal, echoing truth of his own making. He was at the bottom of a well, and he had dug it himself. The air was thin, the walls slick, and there was absolutely no one to call for help. Just him alone with the brutal, echoing truth of his own making. The broken wrench lay still on the greasy concrete, a silent witness to his unraveling. Garrett stared at it, then at his reflection in the dark window pane, a ghost of the man he thought he was. He saw the permanent scowl etched around his mouth, the weary lines fanning from his eyes, the defeat in his slumped shoulders. He looked like every frustrated guy he'd ever seen grumbling into a beer, convinced the world owed him something it just wasn't delivering. Only now he was that guy, and the world had finally called his bluff. A strange quiet settled over him, not peaceful, but the kind of stillness that follows a deafening crash. The anger, the self-pity, the endless loop of blame, it all just stopped, drained out of him like oil from a busted engine. And in that sudden silence, a single clear thought surfaced, stark and undeniable. Enough. It wasn't a shout. It was a whisper, a tremor beneath his ribs. Enough of the excuses. Enough of the bitterness. Enough of waiting for someone else to swoop in and fix the mess he'd made. He didn't know what came next. The path ahead was a black void, featureless and terrifying. He didn't have a plan, not even a glimmer of one. All he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, and yet also felt like a cold splash of water to the face, was that he absolutely would not continue this way. The pain of staying the same had finally, irrevocably, surpassed the fear of change. He sat there for a long time, the quiet enough growing in strength, filling the space where the blame used to reside. When he finally pushed himself up off the dusty floor, his knees cracked like old wood. It was still dark outside, but a faint, almost imperceptible gray light was starting to bleed into the eastern sky, hinting at the dawn. He walked out of the garage, leaving the broken wrench behind. The next morning, Garrett's alarm clock shrieked at 5 a.m. like always, but this time, something was different. He didn't slam the snooze button with a grunt of resentment. He didn't lie there for 10 minutes stewing about the meaningless grind ahead. Instead, he swung his legs out of bed. His feet hit the cold linoleum, and a phantom ache shot through his calves, remembering the days he used to stomp off to the factory, already defeated before he'd even smelled the cheap coffee. Today, there was no truck. The repossession crew had taken it in the dead of night, leaving only oil stains on the driveway and a gaping hole in his routine. His first thought, a familiar, ugly one, was to curse the bank, curse the economy, curse the whole damn system. The words were on his tongue, a bitter taste. But then he stopped. He remembered the stillness in the garage, the single word. Enough. All right, he muttered, the word rough in his throat, a pact made with himself. No truck. So what? He pulled on his work boots, each lace an effort. He grabbed his lunch pail, just a couple of sad sandwiches today, no cash for anything better. Then he looked at the front door. It was a 3-mile walk to the bus stop and another 2 to the factory from there. 5 miles total, on foot, in the pre-dawn chill. His old self would have called in sick. Would have said it was impossible, unfair, that he couldn't be expected to walk that far. Would have blamed his bad luck, his bad knees, his bad everything. But today the complaints felt hollow, like dust in his mouth. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. The eviction notice was still on the table, a stark reminder. His kids hadn't called back. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. And maybe, just maybe, that was the advantage. Being stripped bare meant there was nothing left to cling to but himself. No more distractions, no more scapegoats. Garrett stepped out the door and started walking. The pavement was cold beneath his worn boots. His shoulders were stiff, his mind still a churning mess of anxiety and lingering resentment. Every step was an effort, a small act of defiance against the gravity of his own despair. He didn't know where he was going, not really. He just knew he wasn't staying put. He wasn't blaming. He was moving. And that, he realized, as the sun began to paint streaks of weak orange across the dark sky, was the only choice he had left. The first painful, clumsy step onto a path he hadn't chosen, but that he now, for the first time, had to walk himself. The first day, the walk felt like a penance, each painful step a reminder of all he'd lost. By the time he punched in at the factory, his feet throbbed, his shoulders ached, and his temper was a short fuse. He spent the shift wrestling with the old urge to complain, to curse the broken equipment, the inefficient schedule, the dumb decisions from management. But every time the familiar bitterness welled up, he'd clamp his jaw shut, focusing instead on the rhythmic clang of the presses, the greasy smell of metal. He worked harder than usual, a grim, silent energy driving him, partly to distract himself from the pain, partly to prove something, though he wasn't sure to whom. He got home, ate his sad sandwich, and fell onto the worn couch, too tired to even think about supper. Sleep claimed him fast, a deep, dreamless void. Day 3 arrived with no less cruelty. The novelty of his new path had worn off, replaced by the dull ache that had taken up permanent residence in his calves and feet. The morning walk was a trudge, not a march. The internal voices, quieted by the shock of his rock bottom, started to stir again, a venomous whisper in his ear. "This is stupid, Garrett. You're a fool. Look at you walking like some goddamn peasant. It's not your fault, you know. It's the system. Always was." He passed a bus stop, the warm glow inside like a siren call. His stomach knotted with longing, to just sit down, to let someone else drive, to escape the biting wind. For a long minute he paused, his breath fogging in the cold air, his hand instinctively reaching for the pocket where a bus fare might have been if he hadn't spent his last $10 on ramen. The bus pulled away, a gust of exhaust stinging his eyes. He swallowed hard, the temptation a bitter taste, and kept walking. By day 7, Garrett was a walking bruise. Every morning felt like peeling himself off the canvas after a heavy punch. His sleep was fitful, his body protesting with every twitch. He'd lost a few pounds, his face a little gaunter, his eyes shadowed. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life, moving through the motions. At work he still kept to himself, but the old frustration bubbled closer to the surface. He saw a new kid on the line struggling with a faulty part, fumbling, dropping it. The old Garrett would have snorted, muttered something about lazy millennials, maybe even offered some cutting advice. Disguised as help, this time he just watched, a knot of irritation tightening in his gut, then sighed and walked over. Without a word, he took the part, gave it a sharp, practiced tap against the bench, and handed it back, fixed. The kid mumbled thanks, surprised. Garrett just grunted and turned away. It wasn't kindness, it was just less rage, a choice not to feed the fire. Then came day 14, and he nearly cracked. He woke up late, the alarm clock having failed, or maybe he'd just slept through it. Panic clawed at his throat. He threw on clothes, grabbed his meager lunch, and burst out the door, already cursing under his breath. The frantic rush added another layer of pain to his already protesting muscles. He knew he'd be late, knew he'd get a warning, maybe docked pay. The familiar spiral began. This is it. They'll fire me. And then what? Just like last time. No matter what I do, someone always screws me over. It's always a setup. He was halfway to the bus stop when a battered old pickup truck, the kind he used to drive, rumbled past him, splashing dirty slush onto his boots. It was the final straw. He stopped dead, burying his face in his hands, a growl escaping his throat. "Damn it all!" he roared, the sound raw and desperate in the quiet street. "Damn all of it." He stood there, shivering, the weight of his failures, his losses, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He wanted to rage, to break something, to yell at the universe for its unfairness, for constantly kicking him when he was down. He wanted to blame the alarm, the slush, the truck, his boss, his ex-wife, his kids, the whole rotten world. But as the angry, bitter words formed on his tongue, something else happened. He heard the echo of his own voice in the empty street, flat and pathetic. And then he remembered the cold, quiet emptiness of his garage, the broken tool, and the stark, awful truth staring back at him in its reflection. The common denominator. Him. He lowered his hands, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was still pissed, still hurting, still raw. But he didn't turn back. He didn't quit. He just lifted his chin, wiped the grit from his face, and started walking again, faster this time, as if trying to outrun the demons snapping at his heels. He'd be late, he'd take the hit, but he wouldn't let it be the end. Not today, not anymore. The battle was still raging, fierce and constant, but for the first time he was fighting for something, not just against everything. And the smallest flicker of something, not hope, not yet, but stubborn, unyielding defiance, sparked in his weary eyes. The foreman, Big Mike, just stared at Garrett's late punch card, then at Garrett himself. Usually there'd be a snide remark, a deduction from the paycheck, a shrug from Garrett. Not today. Mike just grunted and waved him on. Garrett nodded, a short, almost imperceptible dip of his chin, and headed for the floor. He didn't offer an excuse, didn't complain about the weather or the truck or the world. He just worked. The next few days blurred into a pattern. The 5 a.m. alarm still screamed. The slush still bit. But now, when a machine jammed, Garrett didn't just curse it under his breath and wait for maintenance. He'd get his hands in there, pulling, prying, examining, trying to understand the mechanism of the breakdown. Sometimes he fixed it. Sometimes he couldn't. But the blaming, the impotent rage, it was quieter, replaced by a simmering, focused energy. A different kind of anger, maybe. One that wanted to solve, not just rail. It wasn't a sudden Hollywood transformation. There were still mornings he woke up with that familiar knot of dread, that acidic taste of bitterness in his mouth. There were still moments he wanted to snap at the younger guys or curse the incompetent bosses. But he'd catch himself. He'd remember the emptiness of his garage, the cold ring of his own accusations. He'd remember that terrible, stark truth. The only common denominator was him. So instead of a curse, a deep breath. Instead of a complaint, a question. What now? Around day 20, something shifted. It was small. He'd come home, tired to the bone, and instead of collapsing into the old armchair with a beer and the TV, he started looking at the broken things around his small house. The leaky faucet, the wobbly porch step, the dead light fixture in the hall. For years, these had been further evidence of the world's indifference, more things to complain about. Now they were just tasks, problems to be solved. He found a wrench, a screwdriver, a spare bulb. He worked slowly, deliberately, the small victories. The drip stopped. The light shining, sending a quiet satisfaction through him that had nothing to do with external forces. At the factory, Big Mike started noticing. Garrett wasn't the first to complain about the new safety protocols. In fact, he'd taken the initiative to make sure a stubborn gate was actually closing properly, preventing a backlog. He wasn't the last to leave either, often staying a few minutes extra to tidy up his workspace, leaving it ready for the next shift. When a new guy messed up an order, Garrett didn't jump down his throat. He just walked over, showed him the right way, quiet and direct. No grand speeches, just doing. The chip on his shoulder wasn't gone, not entirely. It was still there, but it wasn't an anchor anymore. It was more like a scar, a reminder of battles fought, of lessons learned the hard way. He still looked like a man who'd seen a lot of hard days, but the quiet weariness was now tempered by a different kind of strength, an inner resolve that hadn't been there before. His eyes, though still tired, held a sharper, more focused gleam. He wasn't looking at the world with blame, he was looking through it for solutions. Weeks turned into a couple of months. Garrett's small house, while still older, felt less cluttered, more functional. The broken things were fixed, the weeds in the tiny patch of yard were pulled back. He even found himself taking longer walks in the evenings, not just to escape, but to simply be. He called his daughter again, not to yell or accuse, but to simply say, "Hey, just checking in, wanted to see how you were doing." He didn't expect a return call, but he'd made the effort without expectation, without blame. He started seeing problems at work not as assaults on his livelihood, but as puzzles. A new efficiency report meant new challenges, sure, but it also meant opportunities to figure things out, to innovate, to make his own corner of the world run a little smoother. He'd even found himself volunteering for a particularly complex, dirty job no one else wanted. "Someone's gotta do it," he'd grumbled, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of pride in his eyes. He wasn't avoiding the hard stuff anymore. He was leaning into it. He was choosing it. One afternoon, a younger guy on the line, barely out of high school, was grumbling about a new machine, about how the company was screwing everyone, how he was gonna quit. Garrett, wiping grease from his hands, just watched him for a moment. He saw a reflection of his younger self, full of righteous anger, pointed in all the wrong directions. "Kid," Garrett said, his voice a low rumble, "you used to think everyone was out to get me or just plain dumb. Lost everything because of it. Job, money, family. Everything I thought I had gone." He looked at his calloused hands, then back at the younger man. "Turns out all that mess, all those times I thought the world was kicking me down, that was my best teacher." He paused, a faint, almost ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You hit bottom, there's nowhere to go but up. And you learn quick what you're really made of. You learn you can take a punch, You learn you can get back up, stronger. That's the real advantage, kid. Not luck, not handouts, not who you know. It's knowing you can take a punch and get back up and build something new out of the damn rubble. That's everything. Some men, they spend their lives waiting for the storm to pass. Others, they learn to dance in the rain. But a few, a very few, they learn to forge their own shield and sharpen their own sword right there in the eye of the hurricane. They learn that the greatest strength isn't avoiding the fall,